What are we saying and what are we not saying? We are not saying that everything I'm about to talk about and its innovations were done by Christians. But we're about to make the case that it was Christianity that brought us out of the Dark Ages, and I'll show you why. But for right now, let's just take a look at mathematics and the masters of the mind-mangling complex. There is Tartaglia, famed cubic equations, Peter Gassendi, lunar crater named after him for his work on falling bodies. How apropos is that? Roberval was the study of integration. Simon Stevin, Francis Viette, those weird algebraic equations that you had to deal with in high school. Then Copernicus, hey, we know him. Cavalieri, Leibniz developed the method of indivisibles, calculus. Modern hospitals came to fruition at this time. You see, the tradition of hostels goes all the way back to the Jewish community at the time of Christ, where they provided hospitality and healing to pilgrims visiting the temple in Jerusalem. The earliest hospital, founded at Rome, was around 397 by a woman, Fabiola. She was the predecessor to Mother Teresa. The first charity hostels were done by Bishop Leontius. Bishop Eustathius built a house for the sick. St. Basil, 4th century Greek bishop, made a philanthropic community outside the walls of Caesarea with hostels, church, a soup kitchen, and then employed physicians to attend the sick. By 500 AD, the expansion of almshouses, orphanages, hospices, as well as hospitals. Why, heck, there was even a 200-bed hospital in Jerusalem by 550. The hospital at Constantinople was even larger, with facilities for surgery and a special section for eye diseases. By the 9th century, the larger hospitals employed administrators, staff physicians, nurses, and physicians. In fact, most of the major communities of Europe had a hospital for roughly every 1,400 people by some historical accounts. Now, these historical epics also set the stage for our founders' most important principles of government. Let's take a look. The ideology of a republic comes to our founders from Roman historians Tacitus, Petrarch, and Cicero, who lamented the demise of the Roman Republic. Where did this political rebirth begin, though? As one might expect, St. Augustine is in there somewhere. Men and women are unique paragons of creation. They are not animals. And therefore, they exercise free will, intellectual rationalism, as well as will. Interestingly enough, defined as the motivation that moves us to act. And then comes St. Anselm, argues that rational beings determine what is right and wrong as far as they possess the will to preserve the exercise of virtue. That's a rather interesting concept. That is, virtue is a matter of personal responsibility, and it is the key to preserving one's liberty. Albert the Great argues success depends on your accurate judgments of the world and what options are open to us. That is, liberty is a two-part function. Anselm's will of virtue to preserve it, and the knowledge, options to act. It's not a coincidence that this sounds very similar to the Puritan moral code and their penchant for education that we talked about earlier. George Washington, too, echoes the central necessity of Christian morality.
Let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. George Washington.
These principles of liberty lay dormant until, believe it or not, this guy. And you go, wait a minute, That's Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli wasn't a bad guy. We'll get into this a little bit later. He was actually a patriot. He wrote the book The Prince, not because he was teaching some young man how to be a tyrant. He was showing the city of Florence, who had just run out the de Medicis and their tyranny, how to create a new government. A government that, instead of being a monarchy or based on an aristocracy or a theocracy, instead, he's a genius. He combines all three, stating that if there are three warring factions, then probably what they agree on is good for the whole nation. And at the center of this concept of republicanism is the pursuit of civic virtue, to ensure that the civic virtue by government is a constitution, along with its Bill of Rights. See, the Constitution is just the operation of the government. What do you think the Bill of Rights is? Well, according to John Locke, it's part of the contract, the public list of virtues that the government is required to uphold for its people. Here's a difference. Government does not define the virtue. You do. You need convincing? Take a look at the Constitution and then look at the amendments. The 17th Amendment addresses the corruption of senatorial appointments. 13th Amendment's slavery. Then prohibition, voting rights for women. In every case, those amendments redefine the public list of virtues to be upheld by government. So when a government official says that the Constitution is obsolete or a hindrance, what is he doing? He's voiding the public contract by imposing his own autocratic structure. And this, according to John Locke, is unbridled tyranny. Now you understand the danger of activist judges who circumvent the public contract by bypassing constitutional processes, for example, gay marriage, no matter what side you're on. But now it reflects the public virtue. And they did this going around the constitutional process. Despite majority opposition, infanticide, abortion now reflects the public virtue. That's what the document is. And if they ever recalled the Second Amendment, it would declare that the public does not have sufficient virtue to protect itself. Rather elitist, I think. And it all comes back down to virtue. It's front and center for our founding fathers. Heck, we don't even have it in our lexicon today. Then comes the third part. We're just going to touch on it because we're going to go into it a lot more next time. Not so much the plagues itself, but the ramification of the plagues set the stage for what our founders considered the worst scourge against humanity, the divine right kings. And that brings us to the point. The reason our founding fathers based this nation firmly on the tenets of biblical Christianity was a practical one. For no other social epic generates the freedom, security, and foundations of prosperity like no other. In fact, it is the reason why John Adams wrote,
"The Christian religion is, above all the religions that ever prevailed or existed in ancient or modern times, the religion of wisdom, virtue, equity, and humanity. Let the blackguard Paine say what he will. It is resignation to God. It is goodness itself to man." John Adams, July 26th, 1796.
And every generation of Americans understood this principle because they understood it as the key to personal liberty, whether they were believers or not. Such a foundation is who we are in light of the American truth.
Next time on A Heritage Lost, the American Truth.
It is difficult to imagine a civilization so hard-pressed for so long. From its timely birth just before the demise of the Roman Empire, to its steadfastness throughout the Dark Ages winter, and its struggle against tenacious and ruthless enemies. Considering such beginnings, the Christian epic should never have survived. But it did survive, and it thrived, eventually laying the moral foundations of what would become the most dynamic and progressive era in European history. This is the legacy of the tenets of Christianity applied to society that our founding fathers recognized. But along with such perspective comes a dire warning. For virtue and theology alone are insufficient to sustain liberty. In addition, education of our history and the cause and effect of morality and its impact on liberty must once again emanate from the biblical Christian church and its intellectuals. For no other moral source can be entrusted with such a role. And the reason why is where we're going next. For the ensuing struggle for the rights of man of the divine right king's era would give credence and confirmation to our founding fathers of the strength of their foundation. So please join me next time for our next episode, The Divine Right King's Experiment, right here on A Heritage Lost, the American Truth.